on Mr. Dyson's work session. I believe we have Mr. Stewart from legal and Mr. Grant from the school district.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead. While they're getting ready to open up this work session, we'll do introductions. Felix Rivera.
Gretchen Wenloff.
Pete Peterson. John Sullivan.
Brett Dyson.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Is Mr. Croft on the phone? All right, I guess not. Thank you. All right, and then if we could have our presenters state their name for the record as well.
Ryan Stewart, Assistant Municipal Attorney, STUART.
Mike Graham, I'm Chief Academic Officer at Anchorage School District.
Jim Anderson, Chief Finance Officer, Anchorage School District.
Andy Ratliff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget for the school district.
Cindy Anderson, Senior Director of Special Education for the school district.
Thank you. All right, and yes, Ms. LaFrance is back in the room. Okay, so I understand that we have a PowerPoint presentation and then some discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sure, go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. I'm here by telephone, and if you would permit me, I'd like to make an opening statement.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Thank you. This resolution only asks the legislature and its research arm to analyze and see if there is a way that we can raise the local contribution under very specific conditions without jeopardizing the some $90 million worth of federal money. The federal money is, as I understand it, is DOD, and it is to reimburse communities for the additional costs due to military personnel in the area. My position is that Anchorage has an impact from many the education it does from many children who are not, or their origin is not from Anchorage. Those are kids particularly needing special ed, the technical programs, a new boarding school for Native children and so on. And I'm hoping that the legislature and its research arm can find a way to justify our local citizens, if they choose, to raise our taxes and to help provide even better services for children who come to us from outside of the district. And I don't have great expectations. I believe this is a good thing to do. I am not at all confident that the legislature will do anything this year, but I think it's a worthy analysis to have to see if we, in Anchorage's great tradition of being a service to the rest of the state, if we can enhance the services we provide for students whose origins are outside of our municipality. And thanks for having this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson, for that opening statement. I have Mr. Trainee with a rebuttal.
Mr. Stewart, I got a question for you from legal. Would you check the federal government law? I want to make sure we don't have anything out there relative to this. I understand this quote state law, but in years past we were told there was some state federal law that limits what we can give as a local school district. And I want to know what the parameters on that are. If you'll find that for us, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely, Assemblyman. Through the chair, I believe the PowerPoint presentation today will go directly to that question.
Okay.
And it looks like we're on.
Go ahead, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the PowerPoint presentation today is really sort of a high-level overview of the operation of public school funding broadly in the state. It does not capture all of the nuance that's baked into this fairly elaborate interdependent system, but it should give, I think, some contours to the operative parts of this. for purposes of having a discussion. I do believe we have some personnel from ASD here as well today who I hope might be able to speak to any specific questions the group may have. So without further ado, and starting with the constitutional mandate at Article 7, Section 1 of the Constitution, that constitutional authority is delegated to home rule and first-class cities in the state, organized boroughs, and rural educational attendance areas. That's the flow of the constitutional authority for management of the public schools. Now, by statute, management of the public schools, by statute, public school funding consists of three basic funding sources: your state aid, your required local contributions, and your eligible federal impact aid, all of which have specific definitions, which we'll get into here. What this means, to take a quick step forward at the district level, really requires a basic determination of your basic need of the school district, another one of these terms of art. Briefly, that's a multi-part formula that depends on your average daily membership within the district. That's the student population that gets adjusted through a number of different factors for considerations such as school size, special needs requirements in the district, cost differentials among the difference, etc. And you also have your base student allocation set by the state, which is $5,930 for fiscal year 2020. The final determination is really taking the district adjusted average daily membership, multiplying that by the base student allocation, and you arrive at your basic need for the school district. This is from the State Department of Education and Early Development. I included it here to show that the $5,930 base student allocation in 2020 has really been flat since 2017. You can see it's about a 10-year look-back period here of the base student allocation set by the state. And similarly, here's a 10-year look-back at average daily membership in Anchorage School District. Essentially, it's ranged between 47,000 and 49,000 for purposes of making the basic need calculation. That's a lot of information that's been distilled down to a few slides. So I have brought with us a handout from the state that goes into further detail about the sort of parts within that framework that results in determination of basic need. So to get back to the three funding sources, we have required local contributions, we have the eligible federal impact aid, and then we have the state aid, the three sources of funding for public schools. The required local contributions piece defines the magnitude of the required contribution. It need not come from a property tax or any specific source, but that is the calculation that is used to generate the raw number. So on a district-to-district basis, that number is equal to a 2.65 mil property tax levy in the district, not to exceed 45% of that district's basic need in the preceding year. Eligible federal impact aid, you'll often hear referred to as Title VII or PL 874 money. It has some different categories for different types of federal impacts, but what it often means is that it's intended to compensate districts for parents who are living or working on federal lands, or districts that have tax-exempt federal property within them. That aid is paid directly to the school districts, and its inclusion, federal impact aid inclusion in the state funding formula, is dependent on the Department of Education certifying that funding formula. And just remember that bit. We'll reach that in another slide here. The third piece, the state aid, is essentially the uncovered amount of basic need after the local and eligible federal monies have been applied. The calculation roughly looks like basic need minus required local compensation minus 90% of eligible federal impact aid is your state aid number for that district. To get back to federal impact aid, again, inclusion of that money in the funding formula requires certification by the Department of Education that your funding formula is what they call equalized, and that's a specific standard that's set by the Department of Education. They have certified the current state funding formula, which means that it can take into account those federal impact aid monies in the funding formula. On the back side of this, the state has to annually submit disparity test calculations to demonstrate that the maximum disparity in per pupil revenue between districts is not greater than 25%. That's what this equalization of disparity is meant to control for and account for. The sort of bottom line takeaway there is that changes to the funding formula and or disparate impacts between the districts could potentially jeopardize inclusion of impact aid in the funding formula. And there at the bottom we see sort of a rudimentary approximation of the funding formula and what happens if that federal aid is not taken into account. That becomes a very different equation there and essentially shifts that portion of federal impact money to the state's responsibility, since the required local contribution remains defined as the 2.65 property tax levy amount up to 45% of preceding year's basic need.
Before we move on, Mr. Trainer.
Stuart, how is the state backing away from their promise for the state school construction going to impact this? Because in past years, they've said, use a word, said, they agree if they've got the money to give us the bonds. They're not going to now. So how is that money going to impact this factor? Because it could raise the average property tax by $430 just to cover the cost of the building.
Yes, so the PowerPoint doesn't directly take on that question, but if I believe the number is $41 million of bond debt that the state would not be covering. There are some options, I believe, as to how that could be handled.
I think that's outside of the formula.
Okay, I just want to make sure it is
It's outside of the
okay?
formula, is my understanding.
Because it's another thing thrown into this mixture.
Right.
And then I think the school district might have something to add. Go ahead.
Through the chair, the training, it only applies to operational funds.
Okay.
So capital plans of any type, student nutrition, transportation, all of those would be exempt from the foundation formula.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Training. Mr. Constant.
So, on the first slide, you have the base student allocation. Where does that fit into this equation? Is it just under state aid as one portion of that, or is that all aside from that, and then this is kind of the moving parts?
So base student allocation would be one of the figures that goes into the calculation of the basic need. So it's setting a presumptive number that the three funding sources need to align to reach.
So it's like, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to make sure I'm following, if say the local contribution would be increased, that could change this equalization standard or ratio, and that could jeopardize the state's eligibility for federal funding, which would mean that the state would end up paying a larger share of the cost. Is that what?
No.
No?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, under this funding formula, that's how the equation would have to be balanced, because it's set up so that the state is left with the share that is not covered by required local contribution or eligible federal impact aid up to 90% of the federal impact aid.
And then Ms. Evans.
I just noticed, Chair, I think the school district could add into this, and it's difficult for them for you to be seen there because they have the nitty gritty. Did you have a comment, Nate?
I do, through the chair to everybody, I guess. So to put it simply, the state can't violate by 25%. We were in Juneau last week. They're hovering with a few percentage points to spare on the disparity test every year. So, but to put it in real perspective, only 2 states in the nation even go through the effort to claim the disparity test. In Alaska and one other. The rest of them, they let the school districts get the federal impact aid and they don't worry about it. So it's not as if this is a nationwide, every state struggles with this. The vast majority of the nation doesn't even worry about the disparity test. So really, the state gets to take back, because they've proven that it's less than 25% difference from us and Kotzebue, for instance. So the 90 million some odd that comes in for federal impact aid, they get to subtract that from what the state pays out. So it doesn't really give the state more money. It lets them pay less money out, and so it really is a cost savings of about $90 million. So if the state were to choose not to continue down this path at all, which most states have chosen, then really it wouldn't be an issue.
All right, thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Weddleton, and then before you start, Mr. Dyson, since you're on the phone and this is your resolution, feel free to just let me know when you want to speak. Go ahead, Mr.
I sure will. Thank you.
So you say most states don't bother with the 25% difference because they don't have to worry about it, or it's just like no one's really watching?
Well, some states don't have a lot of federal land anyway. There are some states where there's hardly any military installations and or no tribal lands. So those states, it really wouldn't apply in any case. But there are a lot of states where it's really a small amount of money, and the big picture of several $1 billion for education, most states wouldn't put forth the amount of effort it takes for $90 million.
Thank you, Ms. Weddleton. Sure, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Are there states, thank you, Mr. Chair, are there states that aren't meeting the disparity test but are still giving the federal funding, i.e., do people challenge it and still get it, or is it pretty certain that if you don't meet that disparity percentage, that then you won't get the federal funding?
But the reality is we would get the federal funding regardless of whether the state met the disparity or not. The difference is now they'd have to give us what they subtract as well as part of the state formula. So because they use the test, they get to subtract out a portion of the federal impact aid and not pay us what would normally come out of a state formula. So
They being the federal government.
either way, we would get the federal government money. The state doesn't get it. We would actually end up with more. If we failed a disparity test for whatever reason, the federal government would still give us our $9 million, but the state wouldn't be able to subtract it from basic need, so they would be giving us more than they currently give us.
Theoretically.
By law, it would work that way. The federal government wouldn't allow them. They would say, you failed the test, so you don't get to subtract the impact aid from the basic need. You need to give them the basic need. So the state really doesn't want to fail the disparity test. It really only costs the state about $90 million.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Constable.
Thank you. Only $90 million. So, that is an easy thing to say, but the fact is, if you divide that number in half, because for half the population, roughly, Anchorage gets a $45 million hit, and then they have to pay, that comes out of somewhere magical, and then next year the base student allocation goes down, because they recognize we can't afford to pay this. And so then it costs everybody everywhere, right? And so it's more than a simple thing of saying, well, if we push out of this system, then we're going to get more. It actually has a cost, a substantial cost, right?
Well, the reality is the state pot for education, this is where it would impact the entire state.
Right.
We're not going to get a lot of support anywhere outside of Anchorage for even considering failing a disparity test. So if the state education pot is $3 billion, whatever it is, that pot doesn't get bigger. Right now, they get to pay $90 million less out. So the $90 million now that they have to pay more, it comes from everybody. It comes from everybody because the pot is still the same size. So it would put them in a dilemma.
But it's not dispersed equally. That's the other thing. Anchorage is like 7 to 8 million of that 80 to 100 million in any given year.
Right.
Some districts that are entirely tribal lands will have like $20 million, even though their total budget may be like 40. So it's not equalized across the state. It's just depending on how much untaxable property you have.
You have some really small districts with just 1,000 or 2,000 kids getting $20 million.
And so if you could just state your name for the record. Just
Andy
so-
Ratliff, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Thank you.
For the school district or for the state?
School district.
School district.
All right, thank you, Mr. Constance. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, continuing on here, and again, there is another handout that has more specific information regarding how impact aid works. Regarding local contribution, so as discussed, the required local contribution is established by calculation of 2.65 mill rate levy. That is the minimum amount, and that a district may voluntarily contribute more. However, that is capped by the legislature. There is a maximum local contribution, and that number is equal to 23% of the district's basic need, or an amount equivalent to a 2 mil tax levy on real and personal property in the district. And it's been specifically capped by the legislature for these purposes in order to help ensure that we will pass a federal disparity test among the districts, and so that the state can continue to include that eligible impact aid in the funding formula, so they're not having to pay that money out from the general fund themselves, as school district stated. And then the final point here, just in kind of framing the issue, is that the municipality of Anchorage does currently make the maximum local contribution under this formula. And that
Mr. Chairman?
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. So this gets right to the point here, I think. So I'm hoping that the legislature can find a way that if Anchorage chooses, Anchorage citizens can tax themselves more to make up for the deficit for all the students who are here in Anchorage's system, but whose parents are not tax-paying members of the municipality. So that's where I think we can find a chink here that we may very well be able to, if we choose, tax ourselves to provide more services, both for our own kids and the kids that come from outside. And I think that we ought to be able to rationalize that and make that not violate the disparity.
All right, Mr. Trainer.
You've got a look on your face. Go ahead.
So part of that is if they're here during the count period, then that all goes into our adjusted ADM, and we get the state money for it, thereby increasing our local contribution for that. So we would be able to tax to the cap based on the students that are here during the count period, regardless of where they're from.
Did you have any further comments? No?
I didn't see it.
Yeah. All right, Mrs. Francis, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just digesting what Mr. Ratliff said. And I have a question to Mr. Dyson.
Sure.
And Mr. Dyson, the part that you mentioned about covering the non-taxing people, or I'm not sure quite how you phrased it, but the folks who don't pay taxes, and so we are looking for a way to cover that cost. Or would you mind rephrasing that to the chair? What you had said?
Yeah, so, I mean, Anchorage, from its inception, really is here, there, in order to mostly provide services to the rest of the state. Certainly transportation, legal, healthcare, and education and social services are a part of that. So we have students who are coming to Anchorage for those exceptional services that they can't get somewhere else, or their parents decide that. And so that we're taking care of somebody else's kids, and from my perspective, cheerfully. And if we want to tax ourselves to be able to better serve those kids and have less penalty for our own, I think we ought to be able to do that. It's a self-sacrifice on the Anchorage citizens' part. But I'm hoping that this thing can be framed such that if we choose to tax ourselves more, that delta is to make up for the impact of students who come without their parents being in a position to pay the local contribution part of it.
Anything further, Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just ask if someone from the school district might respond as to the degree to which we have students coming from other communities who don't have parents here or who don't pay property taxes.
I'm Mike Graham, Chief Academic Officer. Just to answer part of that, we do have some that come in and out for the services, largely through what we call our special schools, and that the educational services we provide to some of the residential treatment centers, North Star Behavioral, and we have, I believe, 9 or so different programs out there that they come from. Mr. Dyson asked us to try and find some numbers, so looked and came up this year through those programs, and again, in and out, we've had 335 students from out of district who have been in Anchorage in some of those programs, 86 of whom are there right now. So again, this is sort of a transit thing. Kids come in for treatment for a while, then they go back out. So currently we have 86 out of 335 for the year. Most other students, if they come in from outside, it's probably going to depend when they come from. Parents would have to turn over guardianship to somebody. They have to be living with the guardian who is here. A lot of them do have adult grandparents, aunts, uncles, things that they would go with. And then the funding, as Mr. Ratliff would say, is kind of going to depend when they come. If they're here during the October count, we get the money for them. If they come in November, we don't get any money for them. The same thing happens if we have students here who leave. We don't have to give the money to the other ones either. So it's kind of when they come and go. Yes, we do have some turnover through those programs. Particularly those
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. I assume that the same process is going on with kids who come from outside of the city for our STEM program and various apprenticeship skills programs as well. But the argument that those kids that are here, when we do the count for the basic student allowance, that's fine, but that doesn't have any impact on the local contribution. So I think it's fine to get the extra money if the kids are here in October, but regardless, the taxpayers are paying for the local contribution, no matter when they come. But thank you. This is really helpful discussion.
Yeah, when he's talking, Mr. Dyson, when he's talking about the STEM kinds of things that were coming, I believe, Mr. Dyson, you're referring to what Dr. Bishop had talked about during the last joint board and assembly meeting, where she was talking about the partnership we are going to be implementing next year with Lower Kuskokwim, where they have bought the Longhouse. They're going to be bringing kids in and being here for 9 weeks and being able to partake of our of the King Tech Career Center, those things. And I believe either Mr. Ratliff or Mr. Anderson can answer the monetary aspect of that. I don't believe we're losing money on that.
No, it will be a break even. They'll pay us, basically these kids from throughout the Lower Yukon School District, because they can't build a CTE building and staff it for 3 kids in a village. They're going to be using ours. So we're going to open a 3rd tier during the day, which has a cost to it. And we're figuring out the cost of the extra labor and materials and everything else. And they're going to pay us for that. So it'll be a break even for us. What it does do, though, on top of breaking even, is they aren't going to be able to fill every classroom completely. So it's actually going to provide some more opportunities for some of our own students who otherwise couldn't make either of the first 2 tiers to have one more shot at taking those classes in the afternoon. And so the goal is when these kids go back to wherever their home is, they have a full-blown certification in anything from welding, plumbing, carpentry, electrical, small motor repair, diesel, But really, it also does open up opportunities for our own kids as well, to have one more shot during the day to take one of these 9-week courses and get a certification. So it's a win.
Yeah. And I think that's wonderful, but that's not primarily what I was referring to. Do we not have kids from outside of the Muni who are coming in for the King Center and STEM program?
No, we don't at this point, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
We do sometimes have some folks, who are from out of district homeschool programs. Yes, as Mr. Anderson was saying, IDEA, others who they can take classes and courses from us. But that's not a huge number of kids.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee, then Mr. Costa.
Getting back to that building, they bought a building here in Anchorage, that comes up for tax rolls. So is that going to impact the Anchorage taxpayers? Because since it's owned by a city outside of Anchorage, it comes off our tax rolls. It's about $7.2 million building. We're not going to be able to tax. So it's $40,000. That's still $40,000. So my question is, are they going to give them additional money to the city because they're going to take off the tax rolls? Are we just going to, our taxpayers going to bite the bullet for having a program for people outside of Alaska, outside of Anchorage, come in here and go to school?
That's a fair question. I'll take it back to the school district.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Costa.
Two comment on the question now. I have been engaged in a conversation with the census office and the CFO about that, and next year will qualify for the tax exemption. So if there's a payment, great, but starting next year for sure, that property will be on the tax roll.
They're just impacts our taxpayers.
Yeah. And impacts of the taxpayer, that's the important question for me that we need to have a conversation about in the context of this proposal. And I'm agnostic yet on which direction to go. I have many hesitancies about us expanding how much we're going to contribute in the face of the fact that I have, as I've said before, seen probably a dozen occasions when the legislature took the opportunity when a local entity said they're going to pay for it as an opportunity to cut additional funds to make sure that it continues to equal out. And so we would just be on the hook. But the broader question I have is like line 20 to 23 in this resolution makes a assertive statement that Anchorage is viewed as the hub of educational and disability services for most of the state. I don't know that that's true. I don't know where that comes from as a fact, a stipulated fact. But I see a risk there in that if we set a policy that establishes we will send us all your kids and our taxpayers will pay for it, we put ourselves in a very strange position where these operations may start popping up all over the place, and that may continue as a heavy tax onto the taxpayers of the city of Anchorage. And so I want us to contemplate those impacts as we have this conversation, because I understand the spirit of ensuring that we're able to provide better and more education, but I don't want us to open up Pandora's box.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Good points. Anyone else on this? On the resolution or anything that was brought up in the presentation?
If I could
Yes,
speak
go
to
ahead.
the statement. So I would say that we are the hub for mental health across the state, but there are also mental health facilities in Kenai and Matsu as well. But we're not, for special education, we do get students who are placed by OCS in foster care or OCS in therapeutic foster care, where students have more significant disabilities and the communities in which their parents reside can't serve them. We also have an MOA with the state where we run the Alaska State School for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and any student within the state who is deaf can choose to attend our Alaska State School. Right now we have 4 students who are attending from out in rural communities, but there is not a large, I would say it's more the mental health component, where kids come and go for services, and then we do have some students that come for therapeutic foster care or for our Deaf and Hard of Hearing program.
Thank you.
Just as a matter of note, my second job in Alaska was at the Volunteers of America. I was a teacher's assistant at the ARCH program, so I'm really clear on how these programs work and why they exist in the community. And I assume that's what you mean by these programs that serve mentally ill or people with those kinds of disabilities. And so it's an important place to focus. It it's an important thing to understand the ramifications of.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Trini.
I understand your concern on the term hub, but we are the hub. Whether it's education or corrective criminal system, we're the hub. How many people get into the justice system and then they get out, they stay here next because you've got facilities for the treatment they need. Whether we like it or not, we're the hub of Alaska. We look at the foundation formula, it starts here. Everybody else gets an increase outside of Anchorage. We are the hub. May not be a state capital, but we're sure treated that way in some cases.
Yeah, and yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, I think we're close to the end of wrapping up here, and let me reiterate that I am in no way wanting to jeopardize the federal grant and so on. But even if the legislature did something that allowed us, under careful conditions, to make an additional contribution, we would still have, people would still have to convince Anchorage citizens to both raise the tax rate to subsidize these services and raise the tax cap. Both of those are a very heavy lift. And I appreciate my friend Mr. Constant raising the issue of the proverbial Pandora's box that we might be taking advantage of. But ultimately, I think we can trust the citizens if they are willing to help out other people's kids. God bless them. But I am not optimistic that in the short term we're going to get there. And convince citizens to raise the tax cap and raise their own taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Ms. Wim.
So, excuse me, Mr. Dyson, I hear the phrase, ask the citizens to tax ourselves. And the concept was, what I just heard you say was via raising the tax cap, not a tax on pencils or something. Is that what you're talking about, is encouraging our citizenship to raise our tax cap to handle this? Or what do you mean by we tax ourselves?
I am not encouraging citizens to raise their own taxes. I am encouraging us to have the option to do that if we, the citizens, want to better serve the kids who come here with needs. And now, arguably, it's a zero-sum game, and other kids probably lose a bit. So I'm only wanting us to have the option. As you and all of us have read the press in the last month, there are lots of citizens that are saying, no, doggone it, we can't cut education anymore. We've got to find a way to provide the needs that ASD needs. And this is one tool we could have in our toolbox for the citizens to approve if indeed they want to leave the education system whole or even improved with more resources.
Do you have a follow-up, Ms. Wimhoff?
Yeah, I was actually going to follow up with the concept of some of the things that our district members said, if that's okay.
Sure.
Right now the trending, as I'm seeing, and I am working in a school that is heading this direction, is inviting people from beyond Anchorage at times. Sometimes it will bring in income, pay for itself. We already have charter schools that do that, as we mentioned in the state, Raven, and different schools. And so I'm thinking that the trend may be Alaska sharing more educational resources in this end, and to tie it specifically to our tax base may not be as practical as following what the costs are. So I guess I'm saying is that I don't think that this is going to stop. I think we're going to continue to see us serving others, others serving us, There may be marine biology opportunities in Homer that Kenai Peninsula Borough would sponsor. I'm just throwing that one out. I'm not saying that that's there. But there are opportunities for us to become more collaborative statewide, and I see that. So that's why I'm kind of, when I hear the concept of taxing ourselves and being the sole supplier, I think as we advance that way, we should consider that cost level and where they come from, and the trade and equalization of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. All right, Mr. Gates.
Thank you. And to address Ms. Wenhop's concern, it reminds me that Mr. Stewart's presentation included the required local contribution source of funds doesn't have to be taxes. It can be some other source of funding. So I'm wondering if in your research, or maybe from school district officials, what other funding sources could be used for the local contribution. And I guess imagining, from what I know of our finances, our trust fund dividend, or perhaps, dedicating revenue from our new hotel up at Transit Center to education or something like that. Are those realistic ways to add to the required local contributions? Or are there some other sources?
So, through the chair, generally when we talk about other kinds of revenue, it's in-kind services such as utilities. Like in Kenai, I believe they provide the cost of utilities to the school district. The school district doesn't pay the cost of those utilities, but it's considered an in-kind contribution. So rather than tax, for us, $200 million for a property tax contribution to satisfy the required local, they would tax $180 in cash and then $20 million in utilities. So it's not an allowance to go over that amount. It's just who pays for it, the services essentially.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, is it Mr. Stewart? Would you mind sending us the presentations, the slides, maybe this afternoon, so as we look at our packet over the weekend, so we have an opportunity to review it again?
Thank you. All right, any further comments on this before I close up the work session?
Does that make sense?
Anything further, Mr. Dyson?
No, but thank you. It's been very helpful.
Thank you. Anything further from the school district? All right. So we're